When I originally developed my theory for the 9th episode of My Adventures with Superman, Season 3, Vi Victus, I predicted that Clark Kent's attempt to regain his powers would become a psychological and ideological test created by Brainiac. I theorized that Brainiac would use Krypton's history to force Clark to confront his identity and choose between Kryptonian supremacy and his humanity. I also predicted that Clark's rejection of Kryptonian ideology would restore his powers, create a new Superman suit, and lead to a confrontation with the Eradicator. After watching the episode, some of these predictions were surprisingly accurate, while others were only partially correct or completely wrong. The strongest part of my theory that was correct was predicting Brainiac's involvement. I expected Brainiac to interfere with Clark's attempt to restore his powers and place him inside a simulation based on Krypton's history. This was substantially correct. Vi Victus places Clark inside a simulated version of ancient Krypton, forcing him to confront the origins of Kryptonian civilization and the ideology that shaped Brainiac. I was also correct that Krypton's history would be central to the test. The episode reveals the violent relationship between Krypton and the Coluans, showing that Krypton's rise to power involved the oppression and exploitation of another civilization. This closely matches my prediction that Brainiac would use Krypton's past to challenge Clark's understanding of his heritage. Finally, I correctly predicted that Clark's humanity would be central to the test. I believed Brainiac would attempt to convince Clark that compassion and emotional attachments were weaknesses. Although the episode approaches this conflict differently, Clark ultimately rejects the idea that power justifies domination. His compassion toward those oppressed by Krypton demonstrates that his humanity is one of his greatest strengths. I predicted correctly that Brainiac would use a simulation, but I was wrong about its structure. I originally expected him to create personalized illusions involving Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen, using Clark's relationships against him. Instead, Brainiac places Clark directly into Krypton's past. The simulation functions more as a historical and ideological experiment than a traditional psychological attack. I was also partially correct in predicting that Clark would have to survive without his powers. While the episode does place him in dangerous situations while powerless, physical combat is not the central challenge. The real test is whether Clark will accept the ideology of the society surrounding him or reject it. My prediction about Brainiac's ideology was also only partially correct. I expected him to defend Kryptonian supremacy, but I did not anticipate how deeply his beliefs would be connected to the historical oppression of the Coluans. This gives Brainiac a more complicated motivation than I originally expected. The clearest mistake about what I was completely wrong about was my prediction that Lois and Jimmy would appear as antagonistic illusions. This does not happen. Instead, the episode focuses on Krypton's actual history and Clark's response to it. Although the theme of Clark choosing compassion remains, the specific scenario I predicted was incorrect. My biggest mistake, however, was predicting that Clark would regain his powers during Vi Victus. I expected his moral victory to reignite his Kryptonian abilities and cause the Fortress to create a new Superman suit. Instead, Clark remains powerless at the end of the episode. His moral victory does not immediately result in a physical reward. I was also wrong about an immediate confrontation with the Eradicator. I expected Clark to regain his powers and travel through the time stream to stop the Eradicator. Instead, his power restoration remains unresolved while the Eradicator storyline continues separately. The biggest development I failed to anticipate was the deeper connection between Brainiac, Krypton, and the Coluans. I originally viewed Brainiac primarily as a representation of Kryptonian supremacy. The episode reveals that his ideology is also shaped by the suffering and oppression of his own people. This makes Clark's rejection of Brainiac's philosophy even more meaningful. Clark does not simply reject Krypton because he prefers Earth. He rejects the belief that strength gives one civilization the right to dominate another. In doing so, he demonstrates that his identity as Superman is fundamentally different from the ideology that created the Kryptonian Empire.
Concluding this by looking back at my original theory after Vi Victus, I would consider it partially successful but ultimately incorrect in its prediction of the episode's conclusion. I correctly predicted Brainiac's involvement, the importance of Krypton's history, and the role of Clark's humanity. I also correctly recognized that Clark would be tested through an ideological conflict involving Kryptonian supremacy. However, I incorrectly predicted that Brainiac would use Lois and Jimmy as psychological weapons and, most importantly, that Clark would regain his powers and receive a new suit by the end of the episode. Instead, Clark proves that he is Superman even while powerless. Ultimately, Vi Victus demonstrates that my theory understood the thematic direction of Clark's story better than it understood the literal events. I correctly recognized that Clark's humanity would be tested, but I assumed that passing the test would immediately restore his powers. The episode proves otherwise. Clark's compassion and morality define him as Superman even without his abilities. The remaining question is how the series will ultimately reconnect that identity with his lost Kryptonian powers.